back. So, for this topic, we're going to be looking at what happened between the letters. And it seems like an odd topic to talk about in a New Testament setting. But what's really interesting with 1st and 2nd Corinthians is that there's a story that's going on behind the letters. It's kind of like if you were to pick up a TV series and watch for the first time, you watch maybe the second episode, you don't get to see the first episode, you watch the second one, and there's enough information in it to build a bit of a story. You can get a sense of the background of what's going on, who the characters are. But then if you were to watch maybe the 7th episode, and it's like a Game of Thrones where, 50 people die every episode, the whole show seems to be completely different every time you look at it. And you come back later on and you go, what happened? I can see some similarities to the previous episode, but what have I missed? This is ridiculous. It's kind of like that with 1st and 2nd Corinthians. If you didn't know anything else about these letters, you read 1st Corinthians, then you read 2nd Corinthians, it's almost like they're written by two completely different people. And they certainly appear to be addressing different situations, or something has happened, and what have I missed is really all you can say having read it. But what is interesting with 2 Corinthians is that Paul alludes to issues or to little events that have taken place that we have no other context for understanding, because Acts doesn't deal with the story that's going on behind Corinthians. It talks about when Paul was there for the first time, but that's all it has to say about Corinth. There's only one very brief mention about Paul going back to Achaia for a couple of months, and we see that later on. In fact, that visit later on is when Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. But otherwise, there's this whole story that's taken place, this whole ongoing relationship with the Corinthians that Acts makes no mention of. And the reason for that's pretty simple. It's not pertinent to Luke's story. Acts is focused on the big picture of how Paul progressed through the ministry and moving towards Jerusalem. But this story was kind of offline. It was something else. And there's probably many other stories that Luke left out of Paul's life. Well, of course there was, because it's so much information to cover. But it's frustrating because it would have maybe given us some clues as to what is taking place here. Because the writing of 1 Corinthians and what happened between the writing of 1 Corinthians and our 2 Corinthians was all taking place during Paul's ministry in Ephesus, during his 3rd missionary journey. So whilst Luke says, hey, Paul was in Ephesus and he was there for 3 years, all of these other things were going on. There was actually a lot of other trips, and certainly at least one trip back to Corinth that we know of. So clearly something has happened. And in order for us to understand 2 Corinthians, we have to get a sense of what that story was. But the only way that we can get a sense of what the story was is to understand 2 Corinthians. So once we've understood it, sort of, we can get the story, but then it's only by understanding the story that we can understand 2 Corinthians. So we go in this frustrating cycle of trying to understand what the heck is going on. And I promise you, it's led to no end of scholarly discussion as to what happened between the letters. It is still an ongoing discussion, and honestly, every Corinthian scholar on the planet is just looking forward to seeing Paul and saying, Paul, who was right? What the heck was happening when all this was taking place? So let me recap the story, and that's what this session will be about, is recapping the story and trying to fit in the pieces of what took place between, based on good research and maybe a little bit of assumption. So if you're looking at the slide, you've got the map there of Paul's 3rd missionary journey. That doesn't apply yet, that we're coming to that in just a moment. Let's just go right back to the beginning when Paul first arrived. So the story really begins in 49 CE, and we've covered this as just a bit of a recap of previous discussions. Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, some of those being Priscilla and Aquila. So that took place in 49. About the same time as that happened, Paul was up in Macedonia. So he was preaching in Philippi and so forth. While he was in Philippi, Priscilla and Aquila were going into Corinth. Paul got to Corinth, and that's where he met up with them. And at that point, he made tents. He was preaching. He was doing his thing there with Priscilla and Aquila. Okay, so I've probably got a little bit ahead of the story here. So if you jump in onto the next slide, February, March, in about 50 CE, is when Paul would have arrived in Corinth. So 49, Claudius has expelled the Jews, Paul's in Macedonia. The next year, early in the next year, which is the summer, of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, Paul has arrived, he's travelled down via road through Athens, and it's at that point that he's arrived in Corinth. Now, whilst he's been coming down towards Corinth, Timothy and Silas have remained in Macedonia. Because it was Paul, the Thessalonians, the persecution that broke out, it was Paul that they wanted to kill. He was the one that they were pursuing. So as long as he's gone, whatever. Timothy and Silas aren't really so much the issue. So he's effectively been run out of town. He probably said to them, look, stay here, try to establish the church. I'll meet you in Athens. If not there, I'll meet you down in Corinth. So he heads down to Athens, and then we see Acts 18 and the early parts of that chapter where Paul's preaching to the Stoics and the Epicureans and so forth. In the meantime, the Macedonians have been taking up an offering to send to Paul to help him with his ministry. So all of these things are happening simultaneously. So Paul is in Athens, Timothy and Silas are up there in Macedonia, taking up an offering. Paul heads to Corinth. Eventually Timothy and Silas meet up with Paul, maybe a few months after he arrived. It's impossible to say. Whatever the case was, Paul was in Corinth for a little while, and he was working as a tent maker. At the rejection of an offering of support that he'd received from somebody in Corinth, someone has offered him some support. Paul has said, no, thank you. I'd rather just work. He's gone and made tents. But then, lo and behold, Timothy and Silas have turned up, and all of a sudden, Paul's been able to preach for full time. And maybe someone's asked the question, so Paul, I thought you had to work. I'm not seeing you working much lately. Oh, no, it's okay. The Macedonians gave me a gift. Oh, really? Oh, we offered you a gift. What's so different with our money to their money? Well, as Paul would explain, you were looking for a patronage relationship. You were looking for me to be something of a client, whereas the Philippians, we've sort of developed a partnership. We've come into sort of a missionary partnership where they will continue to support my ministry, and the only obligation I have to them is that I keep doing the work that God's called me to do. So really what they've taken up for Paul is in some ways the first missionary offering. It's really for Paul to, we'll support your ministry, go and preach wherever you're going to go. We'll support it. We can't fund all of it, but we'll give you some support for it. But just do what God's called you to do. Now that's a very different type of offering to what the Corinthians are offering. And now my evidence for this comes later on. We're going to look at all of this throughout 2 Corinthians. But that's basically the tension that's begun whilst Paul was first there in Corinth. And so there's a tension that's broken out now. Some in the Corinthian church have made this offering, and they're kind of like, look, all right, it's offended us, and it's a bit of a problem, but all right, well, maybe we'll just let it slide. The next major event that takes place happens in 51. So Paul's been there for about 18 months now. So he's got there about the beginning of 50, and around about the middle of the year in 51 is when Gallio's now the proconsul, and the Jews make this attack on Paul. We talked about this before, but the Jews have made this attack, and they've tried to bring Paul up on charges of breaking Roman law, with the hope that the Gallio, the governor, might at least exile him, if not kill him. One way or the other, they're just trying to get rid of Paul. And so Paul gets off. There's no charges brought up against him. Everything's okay. But what he realizes at that point is that he's not welcome in Corinth anymore. Well, certainly there is a sector from the synagogue who are working very hard to get rid of him. And look, it's only a matter of time before they bring him up on charges again. And he's been there for 18 months. So it's probably a case of, it's time to move on. Priscilla and Aquila, they're heading over to Ephesus. So if you're sort of looking on your diagram there, Corinth, go across the sea, go past Patmos, up a little bit, and you find yourself in Ephesus. So Paul travels across to Ephesus with Priscilla and Aquila with the intention of eventually coming back to Ephesus to begin a new realm of ministry. So that's where we find ourselves at that point. It's Paul in Ephesus. He sort of goes around, does a little bit of traveling, and he finds himself back in Ephesus. A few years goes past, and he starts to get some pretty bad reports. But we'll look at those in the next video. welcome back. So, we find Paul in Ephesus. He's headed over to Ephesus now with Priscilla and Aquila, and this is in probably about the year 50, somewhere around the middle of the year 50. Paul's headed over there. 51. My apologies, 51. Paul's intention at this point is to circle back around through some of the churches that he's previously established, go and visit, go and just check in again on other work that he's done, and then we'll come back to Ephesus, at which point he's going to begin his third missionary journey. Now, we know that from Acts. That much we know just from the general story that we find there in Acts. So Paul does that. And then he visits Caesarea, Antioch. He goes back through Galatia, but that takes a few months, maybe even a year, for Paul to do sort of that circuit. So Paul's come to Ephesus. He's headed off. Priscilla and Aquila, however, have stayed in Ephesus. It's at that point, whilst Paul's off in these other regions, that Apollos turns up in Ephesus. Now, if you remember the story of Apollos, he's trained in Alexandria. He's an extremely good orator. He's a Jew. He's become a Christian. And so what Priscilla and Aquila do is to fill him in with the full story of the gospel. They give him the whole message, and then they send him over to Corinth. He's a young minister. He's probably, looking for an opportunity. Maybe there's not a lot of work going on in Ephesus, but there's an established church in Corinth, and they maybe say to him, hey, look, you're going to fit in really well over there. Why don't you go over there and with our endorsement? Because Priscilla and Aquila, with Paul, were the original founders of the church in Corinth. So they have some authority there. They've got some say in what happens. Maybe in their old house is where one of the house churches was running, most likely. At any rate, they send him over to Corinth, and he just blows them away. He's just, wow. I mean, you've had Paul, and it was like listening to some old dude that just doesn't even know how to talk properly and not out of monotone or whatever it was that Paul did. And now all of a sudden this TD Jakes turns up, and he just absolutely blows them out of the water. So much so that people start to have their favorite preacher. Now, before you get all pious about this, just think about the last time you were at a conference and you came out to the lunch break and the first conversation you had was, who's your favorite preacher? Or maybe even do it at church. Now, you do it innocently, and that's maybe how it started in Corinth. But soon it became more factional. Soon it became much more divided, particularly with what would have happened would be that Apollos' ministry would have borne its own fruit. People would have come in to the ministry as a result of Apollos' preaching who've never heard of Paul. So naturally they would say, I follow Apollos because I don't know Paul. But factions are starting to form. Divisions are starting to form as a result. So Paul is over there Apollos is over there in Corinth. Paul's doing his traveling, and eventually he returns to Ephesus. Now, at whatever point Apollos came back to Ephesus, we don't know. But at some point or other, he was back in Ephesus because we saw in the previous letter that as to our brother Apollos, he's not ready to return yet. So at some point, Apollos obviously came back to Ephesus, and they're all back there together at some stage. Nevertheless, Paul's back in Ephesus, and he gets a report, probably around the beginning of 53, thereabouts. He gets some sort of letter to which he responds. And the only thing we know about this letter is that it's asking questions about sexual immorality. What the questions were, we don't know. The only reference we have to this is in 1 Corinthians 5:9, where Paul says, in my former letter, I said to you not to associate with the sexually immoral people. And that's all we know about it. Whatever the question was, and whatever the point was, they didn't get it anyway, because Paul had to reiterate what it was that he said. Maybe at that point, Apollos came back. Again, we don't know. But whatever the point, whatever the case was, that former letter, around about that time, Paul and Apollos reunited, or united for the first time in Ephesus. Paul sent this former letter, and that's about as much as we can assume. However, what we do know is that it wasn't heeded, they didn't understand it, and they sent Paul a response. So around maybe a year later, because remember, to write a letter in the ancient world takes a lot of time. Okay, you've got to make the papyrus, you've got to sort of space the. Do I give you the long story or the short story? Let me just say it takes a long time. Okay, to put together a letter, certainly the length of Corinthians would probably take a couple of months. Then there's the travel. Then there's just the time that it takes to get that whole process happening. Plus, it's hard to you can't travel through winter anyway. So, about a year, Paul sent the former letter. Maybe about a year later, he's got another report. This time there's a verbal report from Chloe's household, as well as a written report from the household of Stephanas. And it seems that that's actually been brought over with Stephanas. So at any rate, Apollos is now back, and Paul sent his letter, our former letter, which hasn't been understood, so they send back with more questions. Only this time, there's more issues. It's not just sexual immorality anymore. There's all sorts of issues. Denial of the resurrection, women not wearing head coverings, and all these things that we've just dealt with in our 1 Corinthians, they've asked Paul about. So Paul makes a plan. He says, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this, our 1 Corinthians, that one we just spent all those videos working through. He says, I'll send that with Sosthenes, most likely. I'll follow it up with a visit from Timothy, and then eventually I'll go back up around Macedonia, head down south, and I'll meet up in Corinth, and I'll be kind of the final say in what happens there. I'll be the kind of the final follow-up as a result of this letter. So that's what we've got ourselves to so far. Paul sent our 1 Corinthians, which with all of the content that we just worked through in all those videos, he sent that with Sosthenes. Timothy's going to follow it up very shortly. Meanwhile, Paul's going to head north, and then he's going to go all the way up through Troas, across, down through Macedonia, and he's going to meet up in Corinth. Maybe a year later, perhaps, because remember, travel's quite slow. At the very least, that's Paul's plan. And he has every intention of following through with that. I hope you follow it. The problem is, the Corinthians can get a little bit not respond complex well to the letter. What I've in fact done so far is just to reiterate the story that we've seen in all the videos to this point. What we've said is just where we got up to in Paul sending our 1 Corinthians. But I say our 1 Corinthians because it's actually the second letter that he appears to have sent to the church. So we've got up to Paul sending that letter, and with the plan to send Timothy to follow it up, and then he himself to travel north and then head back around to Corinth in maybe a year's time. Well, something changed. Some event has taken place that has just changed all of Paul's plans. So if you're looking at this slide, what I've done is put in black the two pieces of the story that we have, which is our 1 and 2 Corinthians. That's the only pieces that we actually have still. But what these letters refer to are other events that have transpired before and between these two letters. The first one is the former letter in red there, which is referred to in 1 Corinthians 5:9, which we've discussed, and there's not really a lot we know about it. But 2 Corinthians refers to another few events that we just have no other way of knowing how they came about. The first thing that Paul refers to is in 2 Corinthians 2:1, which is some sort of painful visit. And we don't know what that is, but he says, I wanted to spare you from another painful visit. And you go, what painful visit are you talking about? I mean, he was there for 18 months, but it didn't seem to be that painful. There seems to have been another visit or another time that Paul's gone over to Corinth. He also refers to some sort of letter of tears. What is that letter that he's talking about? Well, we don't really know. There's some other letter that Paul refers to that's certainly not 1 Corinthians, and it's definitely not the former letter. There seems to be some other letter that was extremely painful for Paul to have to write. And then the third thing we find is the presence of these false apostles. In fact, chapter 2 Corinthians 10 right through to 13 are addressing this issue of some false apostles or some super apostles that have come into the church at Corinth. Now, they clearly weren't there when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and they certainly weren't there when Paul was there on his first visit. So who are they? Where do they come from? How does this story play out? So we have to try to come up with some sort of story using these little pieces of evidence to try to make a background as to why we have our 2 Corinthians. Because the tone in 2 Corinthians is so different to 1 Corinthians that it's almost as if another person wrote it. Or if it is Paul, which it obviously is Paul, something terrible has happened because his tone is so much more worse than what we've previously seen. So here's what the general points of the story that most, or really all scholars, Corinthian scholars, will agree on. So Timothy has followed up. 1 Corinthians has been sent. Timothy has then followed that up shortly after, still around about the middle of the year in 54. So it's been about 4 years now since Paul was there. He's sent this second letter, and Timothy has followed it up in order to make sure that the corrections and the commands within that letter have been heeded. So that's where things are up to at this point. In the meantime, Paul has planned to go up through to Macedonia, back down to Corinth, where he will meet up again with Timothy and hopefully make sure that everything's still going well with the Corinthian church. But before that happens, before Paul has the opportunity to leave Ephesus, Timothy returns. So he's gone over to Corinth, he's gone to follow the letter up, and what he's seen there is something just that he would not have expected. Whatever these factions were, these I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, has almost pretty much blown out to we hate Paul and we don't think he's an apostle. It's gone from preference to outright rejection of Paul's ministry. Somebody in the group, most likely the head of the I follow Apollos faction, now with Apollos having been there, with Paul's initial rejection of this person's offer of finance, has actually come right around now to completely reject Paul and his ministry in the first place. This person was probably the one that said, hey, when is Apollos coming back? Paul said, he's not coming back. And they've gone, well, stuffed a lot of you. We're going to go and get our own apostles. So then Paul stops what he's doing, changes his plans completely. Originally he said, I'm going to come back through Macedonia, and they would have expected that, in about a year's time. But Timothy's left, and then the next thing you know, Paul turns up. Paul's come back to Corinth for a quick visit, or maybe a lengthy visit, whatever the case was. He's had to drop everything, get over to Corinth to try to sort this mess out, because he's realised that this can't wait a year now. Whatever's going on there, it's about to explode if it hasn't already exploded. And he needs to get over there personally to deal with it, because the letter's not going to cut it. Timothy's not going to cut it. Paul himself has to be the one to come over and deal with the problem. This is what Paul refers to as the painful visit. We don't know exactly what's happened there. The closest thing we can assume is that somebody in the congregation has brought Paul up on charges of embezzlement. And if you remember, Paul has gone, I don't want your money, but then he's asked for an offering. They put two and two together, and that's been the catalyst. Whatever was I prefer Apollos has now become I hate Paul, and actually, not only is he not a genuine apostle, he's an embezzler. He's a fraud. He's a trickster. And that's the repercussions of that are obviously quite devastating. So when Paul's come to address this situation, this issue, they've challenged him on it. Somebody in the congregation has confronted him face to face, and they've accused him of embezzlement. And we know this because Paul refers to what seems to be some sort of pseudo trial that they've brought Paul up on. He mentions it briefly later on in 2 Corinthians. They've brought him up on some sort of trial, and they've made the accusation that he's an embezzler, that he's trying to steal from the Corinthians. Now, it's at that point, and this is one of those moments that you never want to be in ministry. What do you do when in that heated moment, when false accusations have been thrown against you, when you've acted just out of love, and instead it's been treated with suspicion, and actually you've been brought up on false accusations? In the heat of that moment, what do? Do you retaliate? Do you throw out even more nasty words? Do you say things that you know you're going to regret? I mean, Paul's a pretty mature guy. By this point, he'd be in his 50s, he'd been in ministry for a while, he's taken some hard knocks, and he just knows, probably through experience and wisdom, that in that moment, there's not going to be any good resolution. You know, when you're in that argument with a spouse or somebody, the more you push it, the worse it's going to get. Somebody needs to step back, let the situation cool down, come back to it with cooler heads, and maybe talk about it more reasonably. which is what Paul seems to have done. He stepped out of the situation and he said, look, all right, I'm going to go back to Ephesus. I'm going to finish what I'm doing there, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to deal with this. We're going to talk about this face to face. We'll deal with the accusations, and we'll do it when we've got much cooler heads. Well, it doesn't quite work out that way either. What Paul's done is that he now goes back to, no, you know what, I'm going to stop the video there. I'm going to come back, we're going to finish the story in the next video. See you in a moment. Sorry about that, I cut the story off a little bit abruptly in the previous video, so let's just finish it off here. So Paul he's heard back from, Timothy's come back, told him the bad news, things are really looking bad in Corinth. Paul, you need to get over there yourself. Paul drops what he's doing, heads over to Corinth, and at the heart of the issue is an accusation that's been made against him that he's embezzling from the Corinthians, that he's pretending to be holy and pious by not taking their offering, but really stealing the offering with his hand. So Paul goes there to confront them, and this is where they face off, and they make these accusations to Paul. Paul, in probably just some good pastoral wisdom, realizes this argument's going bad places, so it'd be better for me to leave and then to come back when we've got cooler heads. So that's what he does. He heads back to Ephesus with the promise that very soon he'll return to Corinth and he'll deal with this issue in person. Now, even in those cooler heads, even in those situations where you say, you know what, we'll figure this thing out tomorrow, let's do this tomorrow, you're still a bit frustrated. You're still not clear in your mind. It's still all those things going on. Paul gets back to Ephesus and he realizes, you know what, if I come back, it's probably going to be the same thing. It'll probably just be a flare-up of this issue. The other thing about Paul is, when he was in Corinth the first time, he wasn't that great a speaker, so supposedly, the second time he's in Corinth, it seemed to be the same thing. They bring him up in accusations, and he seems to have just sort of cowered away. He doesn't seem to have been a very assertive sort of a person. But what is true of Paul is that his letters are very good. In fact, even his enemies will acknowledge that his letters are weighty and strong, that they're very impacting. And so Paul realizes, you know, maybe the best way for me to do this is actually to send another letter. If I go there in person, it may not end well, but at least if I send a letter, at least to break the ice, that might be a good starting point to make reconciliation, which is what he decides to do. Now, he refers to this letter as a letter of tears. It's a letter that he was ashamed to have to have written, and that came with a lot of pain. It was a very difficult letter for him to have to have written. And we don't know what this letter was. There's some suggestions that it's found within 2 Corinthians. I don't really agree with that. I think it's just a letter that we just don't have anymore. And there's probably good reason for it, because it was such a personal letter. It's of no value to us. There was no reason for the early church to keep it, or even for the Corinthians really to keep it, because it was very personal, probably a little bit embarrassing, and it certainly doesn't have any value to Christians around the world. We'd love to have read it, but it's probably unlikely that we have it. So he writes this letter, rather than coming back, he writes what's known as this letter of tears, as a bridging point, as a starting point towards reconciliation. Now, this time he has a bit of a different tactic. This time he sends this letter with Titus. So he's tried Sosthenes with 1 Corinthians, that didn't work. He sent Timothy over, that didn't work. Maybe try a different person with a different method of dealing with the situation. So he sends what's called a letter of tears with Titus, and he says to Titus, here's what we're going to do. You go over with the letter, you make a start on dealing with this situation, and then come back and meet me at Troas. So if you're looking on your map here, you've got Ephesus down. If you found Ephesus before, just on the end of one of those arrows, head up north, and you'll eventually come to Troas, just sort of up north of what is now modern-day Turkey. It's Troy. Ancient Troy is Troas. Paul says, I'll meet you in Troas. Failing that, I'll meet you in Macedonia. So as the story goes on, Paul sends the letter with Titus, heads up to Troas, and he finds it very difficult. So he leaves Troas, he goes over to Macedonia, and at that point he meets up with Titus, and he talks about this in 2 Corinthians. Now, Titus comes back with some good news. The good news is this, that for the most part there's been reconciliation. The church is sorry, they're repentant, and they've actually gone so far as to deal with this person who first confronted Paul. Whoever this offender was, they've dealt with him, and probably they've excommunicated him from the church, or in some way they've punished him. Paul says, wow, that's a great start. But, of course, there's some confusion, because Paul, you'd said you were going to come back in person, and instead we get this nasty letter. And instead of getting Paul, we get Titus. So, how do we even trust you? You keep changing your mind. I mean, if you're really an apostle, and you're really led by the Spirit, why do you keep changing your mind with your mood? Well, there doesn't seem to, you seem to sort of flip and flop between all different plans and different ideas. We don't really know whether you're coming or going, Paul. And so he's got to clear up that, because there is still some hurt, there's some doubt, there's still some questions that have been asked about his ministry. But for the most part, they're repentant. They've realised, all right, you're not what this guy said you are. You're not an embezzler, but just fill us in, just give us a bit more of the story. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there's a new group of apostles. So come back to when Paul said Apollos isn't coming over. They said, where's Apollos? Send him back. Paul says, Apollos isn't with me. Apollos is with me. He's not coming back right now. And they've gone, well, you know what? This I Follow Apollos group, now they've lost their leader. They don't want Paul. And now they've lost their leader, Apollos, or their favourite teacher. Said, you know what? Stuff the both of you. We're going to go and get our own apostles. So they actually go and bring in some more apostles. Very likely, they're the same apostles that we meet in Galatia. These people that already hate Paul, that are already trying to undermine his ministry, and now they're getting an invite from Corinth saying, hey, you hate Paul, we hate Paul, hey, we've got something in common, why don't you come and be our pastors? Great way to start a church. So they bring in these false apostles. So this is where Paul finds himself. He's sitting there in in Macedonia, and he's got some good news. Then the church has come back to him, for the most part. But there's also some false apostles that have been brought in. So what are you going to do with that? I mean, think about the situation. You've got general reconciliation has taken place, but Paul's not there. What is there is a group of apostles who don't like Paul, and are going to do everything they can to undermine his ministry. So though there's been some reconciliation, it hasn't fully fixed the problem. And more importantly, it's how long that reconciliation can hold together for with these other guys in their presence. Well, it's not promising. So Paul is at a stage now where he needs to do two things. First of all, he needs to write a response. He needs to deal very quickly and close some of those issues that are still lingering. The other thing he needs to do is to deal with these false apostles. He needs to at least fire a first salvo to point out that these guys actually aren't apostles at all, to at least get the Corinthians to deal with them as a starting point for him to then be able to follow it up with his own visit. So this is what he does. He writes a letter, which is our 2 Corinthians, to make an initial response to the issue, which he will then follow up with a visit himself, hoping that this 2 Corinthians has done the job of making reconciliation, or at least finalising the reconciliation. So there's a lot of detail in there. If you haven't caught all of it, maybe watch the videos again, but hopefully that you've got a general gist of the story. What we're going to do in the next topic is to come back and start through looking at 2 Corinthians, and I'll quickly reiterate just where Paul finds himself in those videos, and as 2 Corinthians unfolds, we can come back and we can pick up more pieces of this story and just show how they fit into 2 Corinthians. So don't despair if it's not all making sense just yet. It will unfold as the story continues. So join me then for 2 Corinthians.